Killian, stay with me.
There they are! Get them!
I won't let them take you.
She did not stop to think. That was the truth of it, the part that would haunt her long after the blood had dried on her hands and the forest had gone quiet again. Sabine Voss did not stop to think. She simply threw herself over the stranger's body and took the blades meant for him. 5 of them. The first caught her along the left shoulder, a deep, burning slash that stole her breath. The second found the soft flesh beneath her ribs. The third and fourth came so quickly she barely registered them, only the heat, the shocking intimacy of pain. The fifth grazed her collarbone and slid downward across her chest, shallow but vicious, like a warning. Then the men ran. They ran because somewhere deeper in the forest, torches had appeared, distant shouts, the sound of horses, and the men who had come to finish what they started disappeared into the dark like smoke. Sabine collapsed sideways onto the mossy ground, gasping, her palms pressed against the wounds she could already feel soaking through her linen dress. She had been on her way home from old Petra's cottage with a basket of dried herbs and a jar of fever tincture. She had taken the forest path because she always took the forest path, because it was faster, because she was 23 years old and had walked this route alone since she was 12 and had never once been afraid of it. She was afraid now, not of dying precisely. She had sat at enough deathbeds to know the shape of it. She was afraid of leaving her father without anyone to gather his medicines. She was afraid of the man lying motionless beside her, the one she had just bled for without knowing his name. She turned her head toward him. He was face down in the undergrowth, dressed in clothes that cost more than her father's cottage. Even unconscious, even with the back of his dark coat torn open by what looked like an older wound. A sword cut, she realized, not a blade. Even covered in mud and forest debris, he carried himself like someone who did not expect the ground to hold him down for long. High cheekbones, a jaw that could have been carved from stone, dark hair damp at the temples. Sabine pressed her teeth together against the pain blooming through her side and reached out to check his pulse. Strong, irregular but strong. Good, she thought faintly. One of us should survive this. She did not know how she got him out of the forest. She would not be able to explain it later to anyone's satisfaction, not even her own. She was small and she was bleeding, and he was at least a head taller than her father, who was himself not a small man. But she had grown up hauling water and firewood and sacks of grain, and she had the kind of quiet, unremarkable strength that comes from years of necessary labor rather than any particular virtue. She dragged him by his arms. She stopped twice to press her hand against her side. She bit her lip until she tasted blood to keep from crying out and bringing whatever remained of those men back to finish the job. She got him to her cottage just before midnight. Her father was asleep, which was a mercy. Sabine laid the stranger on the low wooden table where she prepared remedies and stripped his coat with hands that had steadied themselves through long practice. The sword wound was bad but not fatal. It had missed everything vital by what she estimated was roughly the width of 2 fingers. Someone, she thought grimly, had been very lucky tonight. She cleaned it. She packed it with yarrow and comfrey. She stitched it with the same steady hands she used for everything. Then she sat down on the floor beside the table and attended to her own wounds. This was harder, not because the pain was worse, though it was, but because she was tired now, in that bone-deep way that comes after the body has decided the crisis is over. She cleaned each wound methodically. The shoulder was the worst of them. The one beneath her ribs made her hiss through her teeth. The one across her collarbone she bandaged without looking too closely at how long it was. 5 cuts. She had taken 5 cuts for a man she had never seen before. Sabine wrapped her torso with cloth strips and leaned her head back against the table leg and looked at the ceiling and thought, not for the first time, that her instincts were going to be the death of her. She must have slept, because when she opened her eyes again the quality of the light through the window had changed to the pale gray of early dawn. Her whole left side ached. The stranger was still on the table, which was good, and still breathing, which was better, and he was watching her. His eyes were open. Gray, she registered, not warm gray, not soft gray, but the gray of winter iron, cold and absolutely precise. They were fixed on her face with an expression she could not immediately read. Not gratitude, not relief. Something more complicated than either. Something that looked, if she was being honest, rather a lot like calculation. She straightened slowly from the floor, pressing one hand to her ribs. "You're awake," she said, evidently. His voice was low, deeper than she had expected. "How long?" "Since I found you. About 6 hours. She moved to the table beside him and checked the dressing on his back without asking permission. "You lost a significant amount of blood. You should not sit up yet." He sat up. Sabine put her hand flat against his chest without thinking, which was, she acknowledged, a fraction of a second too late. Perhaps not the most appropriate thing she had ever done. Her palm against the hard wall of his sternum. His eyes dropped to her hand. Her face is going warm despite herself. She removed her hand. "The wound will reopen," she said. "I have had worse." He looked at her with that same unnerving directness. "You are injured." "I am fine. Your bandaging is showing through your dress." "I am fine," she repeated more firmly. "You, however, are not, and you will not be if you tear the stitching I just spent an hour placing. So please lie back down and allow me to determine whether you have a fever before we continue this conversation." He looked at her for a moment. She had the distinct impression he was not accustomed to being spoken to this way. She also had the distinct impression that he was deciding whether to be offended or something else entirely. He lay back down. Sabine checked his temperature. Slightly elevated but not alarming. She brought water. She watched him drink it, with the focused attention she gave to all her patients, and tried not to think about his eyes. "What is your name?" he asked, setting the cup down. "Sabine Voss. My father is the apothecary in this village." She paused. "You can tell me yours or not. It doesn't change how I'll treat you." Something shifted in his expression. "Killian," he said. Just the one name. No title, no explanation. Sabine noted both the omission and the quality of his voice when he said it. The faint compression of someone choosing how much to give away. "Killian," she repeated. "All right. Do you know who attacked you?" "Yes." "Are they likely to come back?" "Not tonight." She nodded. "Then rest. I'll check on you in an hour." She turned away to prepare a fever reduction tea, and she did not let herself think about the way his gaze had followed her across the room. Or the fact that when he had said her name, just her name, barely a syllable, testing him its weight, it had felt less like a greeting and more like a decision. She had made a habit of being sensible. It was one of her better qualities. She kept the habit firmly in place. By mid-morning her father discovered them. Ewald Voss was a gentle man with flower-white hair and the slightly distracted expression of someone perpetually occupied with more interesting thoughts than the present moment. He came into the workroom to find his daughter checking a stranger's stitching and went very still in the doorway. "Sabine, Papa, this is Killian. He was wounded in the forest last night. I've treated a sword injury to his back, possible bruised ribs and minor abrasions. He should be stable in 48 hours if the fever doesn't worsen." Her father's eyes moved to the bandaging visible at her collar. "And you?" "I am fine." "Sabine, I will explain everything, but later. Can you check the poultice on his shoulder? I think the yarrow is working, but I want a second opinion." She knew she was deflecting. Her father knew she was deflecting. He chose, with the particular grace of a man who had raised a stubborn daughter for 23 years, to let it go for now. He examined the wound with quiet thoroughness. Killian submitted to this with a stillness Sabine found interesting. Not passive, not resigned, but controlled. A man who knew how to wait. "Good work," her father murmured, meaning the stitching. "She has steady hands," Killian said. Both Vosses looked at him. He was watching Sabine again. There was something in his expression she was beginning to identify as his default mode, that quality of intense, unblinking attention that made her feel simultaneously seen and unsettled. "Yes," her father agreed slowly. "She does." The morning passed. Then in the afternoon. Killian drifted in and out of a light sleep that she suspected was less genuine rest and more strategic stillness. The kind of sleep a man allows himself when he needs to conserve energy for something else. Each time she came near, his eyes opened. Not startled, not groggy. Simply open, fully present, as if he had never quite closed them. It was peculiar, she thought, how someone so clearly powerful could be so entirely at her mercy and not seem diminished by it at all. He asked questions when he was awake. Quiet, precise questions that told her he was cataloging everything. What village was this? How far from the northern road? Whether travelers often came through? Whether the forest path she had taken was commonly used? She answered honestly. She had nothing to hide. "Why did you do it?" he asked, near evening. She was grinding a dried root into powder for a separate compound, and did not look up. "Do what?" "You know what I mean." She did. She kept grinding. "Because you were in danger and I was there." "That is not sufficient reason for most people." "It is for me." She paused, considered, added, "I don't think I could have lived with doing nothing, even if the outcome had been worse." She looked up then. "Do you understand that kind of reasoning?" He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved behind those iron-gray eyes that she could not name. "Better than you might expect," he said quietly. That night, while her father slept, and the cottage had gone dark and still, Sabine sat at the table and let herself admit that she was in more pain than she had told anyone. The wound beneath her ribs was deep. It pulled when she breathed. She had been managing it with the same remedies she gave patients, but she was tired, and the tiredness was making everything sharper. She was still sitting there, head bent, when she heard him move. "You should be resting," she said, without turning around. "A pause." "So should you." He was standing. She could hear it. The careful sound of controlled movement, the slight catch in his breathing that told her it hurt him to be upright. She turned. He was on his feet, one hand braced against the wall, looking at her with an expression that was not quite concerned, and not quite something else, but occupied the exact space between them. "Lie down," she said. "You are pale. I am always pale. You are gripping the edge of that table." She released the table. She had not, she realized, been aware she was doing that. They looked at each other across the small, dark room. "I told you I was fine," she said. "You also told me 5 separate times over the course of today that you were fine. The repetition is beginning to suggest otherwise." She almost smiled. She caught it before it arrived. "Go back to the cot. When you tell me the truth about the wound in your side, it's being managed. By you? Alone?" Something sharpened in his voice. Not anger exactly. Something more controlled than anger. "The people who cut you were trying to kill me. You are injured because of me. I am not." He stopped, exhaled. When he continued, his voice was quieter. "I am not able to simply lie there and watch you manage it alone." The silence stretched between them, thin and careful. "It's deep," she said finally, because she was too tired to maintain a pretense she had never particularly believed in. "Not dangerous, but deep. I cleaned it properly. It will heal." He nodded. He did not push further. He returned to the cot with the same controlled economy of movement she had noted from the beginning, but he did not close his eyes, and she was aware, for the rest of that night, of his gaze on her back, steady, watchful. Like someone standing guard over something they had decided, without announcement or ceremony, was their responsibility. Dawn arrived gray and cold. The knocking began before the village bell had struck 6. Sabine was at the window, pressing a cooling cloth to her own shoulder, when she heard it. Not the tentative knock of a patient's family member, not the familiar rhythm of someone she knew. Heavy, deliberate, the kind of knock that does not expect to be kept waiting. She opened the door. 3 men stood in her small front garden. They wore dark coats with silver insignia at the collar that she recognized distantly, the way one recognizes something seen only in paintings and engravings rather than real life. Their hands were at their sides, but the stance, the stillness, the absolute certainty with which they occupied the space. These were not ordinary men. The one in the center was older, silver-haired, with a face like weathered stone. He looked at her for one moment with eyes that catalogued everything. The bandaging at her collar, the shadows under her eyes, the slight hitch in how she held her left side, and then he said, with the gravity of a man delivering a verdict, "Miss Sabine Voss, we are the Royal Guard of the Duke of Ravensmore." A pause, precise as a blade. "We are here for his grace." She stood in the doorway and did not speak for a moment. Duke of Ravensmore. She thought of iron-gray eyes and one name given without title. She thought of expensive fabric and controlled stillness and questions too precise to come from an ordinary man. She thought of the way he had looked at her across the dark room and said, "You are injured because of me," with something in his voice that she now understood had not been guilt, but rather the particular weight of someone who was used to the consequences of their existence mattering enormously to everyone around them. "He is inside," she said. "He is not well enough to travel today." The silver-haired man's expression shifted, fractionally. "Miss Voss, I understand your concern, however. He has a sword wound that was stitched less than 12 hours ago. If you move him on horseback today, you risk reopening it. If it reopens on the road, you risk infection. If it infects—" She stopped, chose precision over alarm. "He needs 48 hours, possibly 36 if he rests properly, which he is not currently doing." Silence. The silver-haired man and the men beside him looked at each other briefly. "May we come in?" he asked. She stepped aside. The cottage seemed very small, with 3 royal guards in it. Her father, who had appeared silently at the workroom door the moment he heard voices, stood very still, with an expression Sabine had never seen on him before. Not fear. Something closer to profound comprehension, the expression of a man rapidly revising several assumptions about the past 24 hours. Killian was on the cot. He had not been surprised by the knock. She understood that now. He had known, at dawn, what dawn would bring. He had been waiting for them. "Your Grace." The silver-haired man stepped forward and bent his head. "We came as soon as we could trace you." "You are late, Calder," Killian said. And there was no edge in his voice, which Sabine found somehow more pointed than if there had been. "Yes, Your Grace, I apologize. Apusa, we were delayed by the bodies." "How many?" "4. The 5th escaped. We are following." Killian nodded. His gaze moved, as it had been moving all morning, to Sabine. She stood by the window with her arms folded, and her face carefully neutral, and she watched him, and thought about 5 cuts across her body, and a man who had given her only one name, and the particular way that dawn had arrived today, feeling less like the beginning and more like arrival. "Calder," Killian said, still watching her. "Miss Voss will require protection while we are here. 2 men in the cottage at all times. Rotation every 6 hours. Your Grace, our priority, is my instruction." No change in tone. Simply absolute. 2 men, always. The silver-haired man, Calder, looked briefly at Sabine with an expression that contained, she thought, the barest possible trace of startled reassessment. Then he nodded. "Yes, Your Grace." Killian's gaze finally moved from her face to the ceiling. 36 hours, he said. "Then we move. Calder, notify the household." And something shifted in his voice. "Quiet, precise. Be discreet about what happened. I will explain the nature of my injuries myself." "Of course." Sabine watched this exchange and thought about what it meant exactly. That the most powerful man in the Northern Territories was lying on her family's cot in a 3-room apothecary cottage and giving orders to royal guards with the same ease with which most men breathed. She thought about what it meant that those orders included her name, and she told herself, firmly, that the warmth that moved through her chest at that realization was not significant. That it was proximity and exhaustion and the particular way relief settled into the body after sustained crisis. She told herself this with great conviction. She was not entirely successful. The 36 hours passed with a peculiar tension that settled into everything. The way her father moved through the cottage more carefully, the quiet murmur of royal guards outside the door, the changed quality of the air inside the rooms where she had grown up. Killian rested because she told him to, and because, she suspected, he had decided to follow her instructions in this particular space, in a way he clearly did not follow anyone's instructions anywhere else. She checked the wound twice daily. The fever broke by the 2nd morning. The stitching held. He watched her work with those gray eyes and said less than she expected, and more than she was entirely comfortable with. On the 2nd evening, when her father had gone to bed, and the guards outside had been rotated, and the cottage was quiet, he said her name. Just that, Sabine. She looked up from the ledger she was updating. He was watching her from the cot with an expression she had been trying to name for 2 days without success. "What do you know about the people who attacked me?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "I had never seen them before." "And you did not hesitate. I've told you why. You told me the practical reason." He paused. "I want to know the other one." She held his gaze. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in a sound she had heard her entire life. Inside, the lamp cast everything in warm amber and the world felt, for a moment, smaller and more honest than it usually did. "You looked like someone worth saving," she said. It was more than she had intended to give. She knew at the moment the words left her mouth. He was quiet for a long time. "You should know," he said finally, "that what you did tonight, what you did for me, is not something I will be able to simply leave behind." "You are leaving tomorrow," she said. "Practical, sensible." "Yes," he said. "Tomorrow." Not a contradiction, not an agreement. Something else entirely, that lived in the space between them and refused to resolve into anything she could name or dismiss. She closed her ledger. She said good night. She went to her room and lay down on her narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and breathed carefully around the ache in her side. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow he would leave and she would be exactly who she had been before, an apothecary's daughter, a village healer, a girl who took the forest path because she always had. Tomorrow. She believed it completely. Right up until the moment, just before she fell asleep, when she realized she could not remember the last time 36 hours had felt so significant, as if something had been laid down inside her chest that had no immediate intention of leaving, regardless of what she told it. At dawn, the royal guard assembled outside. Killian dressed in the clothes Calder had brought, dark and impeccable and entirely unlike anything Sabine had ever seen up close, and he stood in the center of her father's small workroom, and he was once again, entirely and unmistakably, a duke. He looked at her father first, said something quiet and private that made her father stand straighter and nod once, with an expression Sabine could not read from across the room. Then he turned to her. He crossed to where she stood, and he stopped close enough that she had to look up at him, and she was aware, acutely and unwillingly, of the difference between the man on the cot and the man standing before her now. "Your father will receive compensation for the medicines," he said. "That isn't necessary. It is not negotiable." She pressed her mouth together. "All right? The wound in your side." He paused. "You will rest. You will not take any patients for the next 3 days." She stared at him. "You cannot tell me how to manage my own practice. I can suggest it with great firmness." Something moved in his expression that was not quite a smile and was, she thought, more dangerous than one. "Consider it a request from someone with excellent reasons for your continued good health." The words settled into the air between them. Warm, complicated, entirely too meaningful for a farewell. "Take care of your stitching," she said, because she needed to say something practical, or she was going to do something else entirely. "I have an excellent physician at the house," he said. "He will not be as good as you." She didn't answer. He held her gaze for one more moment. That same quality of attention she had been trying to survive for 36 hours, and then he turned and walked out into the dawn. Sabine stood in the doorway of her cottage and watched the royal guard form around him, watched the horses move, watched the long procession of ducal authority absorb the Duke of Ravensmoor and carry him away down the road that led north, toward the palace, toward the world he actually occupied. She stood there until the sound of hooves faded. She stood there a little longer than that. Then she turned back inside, and she told herself clearly and firmly, and with all the good sense she possessed, that it was over. That it had been an extraordinary thing, an encounter with the extraordinary, and now it was finished, and life would return to what it was. She almost believed it. The summons arrived on the 7th day. Not a letter. Not a message carried by an ordinary courier. A sealed document delivered by 2 mounted men in dark coats with silver insignia, handed to her father at the cottage door with the kind of formal gravity that made the neighbors' curtains twitch and her father's hands go very still. Sabine was in the back garden cutting comfrey when she heard the horses. She came around the side of the cottage with dirt on her fingers and found her father standing in the doorway holding a heavy cream envelope sealed in dark wax, looking at her with an expression she had only seen on him twice before. Once, when her mother died. Once when the river flooded and they thought the cottage would go under. The expression of a man watching something larger than himself arrive at his door. "It's from Ravensmoor," he said quietly. She took the envelope. The seal was a raven in flight, pressed deep into black wax. Beneath it, in handwriting that was precise and without flourish, her full name. Not Miss Voss, not the apothecary's daughter. Her name, written as if the person who had written it had been thinking of her specifically when he did. Sabine Voss. She broke the seal. The letter was not long. It was the kind of letter that did not need to be long because every word in it was load-bearing. She read it once, quickly, then again more slowly. She was formally requested to present herself at Ravensmoor Palace in 3 days' time, for the purpose of providing testimony regarding the incident in the Ashenvale forest. The Royal Investigative Council had opened an inquiry into the attack on His Grace the Duke. As a material witness and the individual who had rendered aid, her account was required for the official record. She would be provided transport accommodation and a full stipend for the duration of her stay. She would be returned safely to her home upon the conclusion of proceedings. And at the very bottom of the letter, below the formal seal in the official language, in the same precise handwriting but smaller, as if added after, as if added separately, as if added when no one was looking, were 4 words: "You will be safe." Sabine stood in the garden with the letter in her hands, and the comfrey smell on her fingers, and the sound of the horses still fading down the road, and she read those 4 words 3 times. She was not a foolish woman. She understood perfectly well the difference between a formal summons and a private reassurance. She understood what it meant that he had added them. She understood what it meant that she was standing here, on a Tuesday morning in a village she had never once wished to leave, reading those 4 words, as if they contained something she had not known she was waiting for. She folded the letter. 3 days, she said. Her father was watching her carefully. "You don't have to go. He needs my testimony for the inquiry. They could take your statement here. They don't need you at the palace for that." Sabine looked at her father. Her father looked back at her with the eyes of a man who had known her for 23 years and loved her without condition for all of them. and who was at this moment seeing something in her face that she had not quite shown anyone before. "Papa," she said gently. "I know," he said just as gently. "I just want you to know that you don't have to." She nodded. She went inside. She began, methodically and without drama, to pack a bag. Ravensmoor Palace was not what she had expected, and she had expected something significant. It rose from the landscape like something that had always been there, like the cliffs and the old forest, not built so much as inevitable. Grey stone that caught the afternoon light and held it differently than ordinary stone did, warmer in some places, colder in others, as if the building had its own interior weather. Towers that were functional rather than decorative. Gates of iron that opened with the smooth, weighted certainty of things that had been opening and closing for centuries. Sabine sat in the ducal carriage, which was as different from any conveyance she had previously occupied as a river was from a cup of water, and looked at the palace through the window and breathed carefully around the wound in her side, which was healing well, but still reminded her of itself when she forgot to be careful. Calder met her at the entrance. He was more formal here than he had been in her cottage, which she had expected, but he was also, she noticed, more careful. He spoke to her with a consideration that told her someone had said something to him about how she was to be treated. She noted this and filed it away. Her rooms were in the east wing. They were larger than her father's entire cottage. The bed alone was larger than her room at home. The fireplace was already lit. There were flowers on the writing table, dark red roses that no one had mentioned, and which had no explanation attached to them. She did not ask about the roses. She unpacked her small bag, hung her 2 good dresses in a wardrobe built for considerably more, and sat on the edge of the enormous bed and told herself, sensibly and firmly, that she was here to give testimony and then go home. She believed this for approximately 4 hours. Then the door to her sitting room opened and Killian walked in. He was not supposed to. She was fairly certain. There were protocols she had gathered about the Duke entering a guest's private rooms unannounced. There were ways these things were done. He appeared to be aware of the protocols and to have made a considered decision not to follow them. He looked better. He had the color back in his face and the shadows under his eyes had cleared. He was dressed as a duke now, entirely and without apology. Dark coat, silver at the collar, the kind of tailoring that made even a wound look like an inconvenience rather than a vulnerability. But his eyes were the same, that iron gray. That quality of complete attention. They fixed on her the moment he stepped through the door. "You came," he said. "You sent a summons. I sent a request. A pause. There is a difference. The Royal Investigative Council needs your testimony, yes, but that is not the only reason you are here." He said it directly, without apology or ornament, with the same economy he applied to everything. "I asked Calder to include the formal language because I thought you would find it easier. A duty you were fulfilling rather than a choice you were making." Sabine sat very still on the edge of the bed and looked at him. "That was thoughtful," she said. "I can be. Occasionally, on a good day." The barest suggestion of that not-quite smile. "How is the wound? Healing? How are you?" "The physician says the stitching is exceptional. He wanted to know who did it." "A pause," I told him. She felt warmth move through her and squashed it firmly. "Is that wise? Bringing attention to— You are already the subject of attention, Sabine." He said her name the same way he had in the cottage, with precision and weight, and something underneath both that she was running out of vocabulary for. "That is part of why I needed you here rather than in the village. The men who attacked me know what you did. The one who escaped knows your name." The warmth vanished. Something colder took its place. "You mean he could come back?" she said. "He will not reach you." Flat, absolute. The voice of a man who was not making a promise so much as stating a fact about the nature of reality. "Not here. Not while I have anything to say about it." Sabine stood up from the bed because sitting felt somehow insufficient for this conversation. She crossed to the window. The palace grounds stretched below in the grey evening, formal gardens giving way to parkland to the dark edge of distant forest. "You could have told me all of this in a letter," she said. "I could have. Why didn't you?" The silence lasted long enough that she turned from the window to look at him. He was watching her, as always, with that unrelenting attention, but something in his expression had shifted. Something she recognized from the cottage, from the second night when she had told him he looked like someone worth saving. "Because I wanted to see you," he said, "and that is a separate matter from the inquiry, and from the investigation, and from the guard on the village or the threat, or any of the practical reasons I could have given you, and which you would have found more comfortable." He paused. "I find I am tired of giving you only the practical reasons." She looked at him across the room, and thought about 5 knife wounds and a letter with 4 words at the bottom and roses on a writing table with no explanation. "Killian," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "I know what you're going to say. Do you? You are going to tell me that you are a village apothecary's daughter and I am a duke, and that the distance between those two things is not something sentiment alone can bridge. You are going to tell me that you have a life and a practice and a father who needs you. You are going to be practical and sensible and entirely correct." He moved slightly closer, not crowding, not pressing, simply closing the distance that the room had been maintaining between them, as if he had decided the room's opinion was no longer relevant. "And then I am going to tell you that I have been thinking about you every day for 7 days. That I have been thinking about a girl who threw herself over a stranger in the dark and took 5 cuts without hesitation, and then spent 2 days telling me she was fine in the most unconvincing possible way. That I have been thinking about what you said to me the night before I left." She was very still. "I have been thinking," he said quietly, "about what it means that the first person who ever made me feel like something other than a title was someone who did not know I had one." The fire crackled. Outside the window, the last light was leaving the sky. "This is not a simple thing you are describing," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "No," he agreed. "It is not, and the inquiry is real and necessary, and it will take 2 days." He paused. "What happens after the inquiry is a separate matter, one I would like to discuss with you if you are willing." His gaze held hers. "Are you willing?" She thought about going home. She thought about her father's cottage and the forest path and the narrow bed in the room she had slept in for 23 years. She thought about the ledger she updated every evening, and the patients who needed her, and the life she had built from ordinary things that she was not ashamed of. She thought about iron-gray eyes, and "you will be safely written" at the bottom of a letter. "I am willing," she said, "to give testimony." His mouth curved. "Of course, and possibly to continue this conversation later." "Of course," he said again, with precisely the same inflection, and the warmth it put in his eyes was, she thought, the most dangerous thing she had encountered since the forest. He left. The door closed. Sabine stood at the window in the darkening room and pressed her palm very gently against her side, where the deepest wound was healing, and she breathed, and she did not let herself think about what she had just agreed to. Not yet. The inquiry convened the following morning in a formal council chamber that smelled of wood polish and old authority. Long table, high ceilings, portraits of previous dukes of Ravensmoor looking down from the walls with expressions of universal disapproval. 7 council members, Calder at the right end of the table, and 1 chair, smaller in position slightly apart, clearly meant for her. Sabine sat in it and gave her testimony with the same composure she brought to everything difficult. She described the forest path, the sound of men and then of struggle, finding Killian face down in the undergrowth, the blades, the torches, dragging him to the cottage. She did not elaborate. She answered questions directly. She did not look at the end of the table, where Killian sat with the stillness of a man who was listening to his own near death, described with clinical precision by the person who had prevented it. She looked once, when she finished the account, and found him watching her with an expression she was beginning to know the way she knew the shape of certain remedies, not by analysis, but by something older and more reliable. The council members asked several follow-up questions. She answered them. The proceeding lasted 90 minutes. It was during the recess, when she had moved to a side room to wait for the second session, that he appeared. Not Killian, someone else. Lord Aldrich Feneth was perhaps 40, well-made in the way of men who had spent money on appearing well-made, with a practiced ease about him that Sabine recognized immediately as the social equivalent of a healer's bedside manner, engineered for effect rather than emerging from character. He had dark blonde hair and teeth that caught the light and eyes the color of new grass that were, she noted, slightly too attentive. He entered the side room with the confidence of someone who expected his entrance to be welcome and introduced himself with a small bow that was technically perfect and somehow still managed to feel like a performance. "Lord Aldrich Feneth, I sit on the investigative council." He paused. "You are even more remarkable than the account suggested." Sabine set down her tea. "Thank you, my lord. 5 wounds." He shook his head with an expression of theatrical admiration. "Extraordinary courage. Though I wonder," he moved slightly closer, "whether the palace has made you feel adequately welcomed after such an ordeal. The inquiry can be rather cold proceedings. I would be happy to ensure your time here is more comfortable. My rooms are very comfortable. Thank you. I meant something less formal." He smiled. Dinner, perhaps. I know Ravensmoor rather well. There are aspects of the estate that visitors rarely see. I would be glad to be your guide." Sabine looked at him the way she looked at remedies she wasn't sure about, carefully and without warmth, and said, "That is very kind, my lord. I'm not sure my schedule will allow it. I could be persuasive." "I'm sure you could," she said pleasantly. She heard the door. She knew before she turned from the quality of the sudden silence that settled over Lord Feneth like a change in weather, who was standing in the doorway. Killian filled the frame in the way he filled every space, not aggressively, not dramatically, simply completely, as if the room had been waiting for him to arrive and had now organized itself accordingly. His eyes moved from Sabine to Feneth and back again in the space of 1 second, and she watched something happen in his expression that was quiet and cold and absolute. "Your Grace," Feneth recovered smoothly, tilting his head. "I was just welcoming Miss Voss to Ravensmoor. I see that." Killian's voice was entirely pleasant. "The second session convenes in 10 minutes, Feneth. I believe Calder was looking for you." A pause, brief and weighted. "Of course." Feneth offered Sabine another smile. "Until later, Miss Voss." He left. Killian stepped into the room and the door closed, and the air between them was different in a way that she didn't have a clinical term for. "He is always like that," Killian said, after a moment. Not a question. He was perfectly polite. He was perfectly calculating. There is a difference. His jaw had a quality of controlled stillness that told her things his voice was not saying. "He is not a man I trust. With the investigation? With you." The words came out flat and honest, and she could see, immediately, that he had not entirely intended to say them quite like that. He looked at her. She looked back. Something shifted in his expression. Not retreat, not apology, but a kind of forward honesty, as if he had decided that if he was going to say it, he might as well mean it entirely. "Feneth is politically useful and personally inconvenient. He is also the kind of man who sees a woman in an unfamiliar place and considers that an opportunity. I don't want him treating you as one." "I can manage Lord Feneth," she said. "I know you can." His voice changed slightly. "That is not the point." She held his gaze and thought about what she wanted to say and said instead, "What is the point, Killian?" He crossed the room. He stopped close to her, not touching, maintaining the careful distance he had held since the cottage, the distance that felt less like caution and more like a wire drawn taut between them. "The point," he said very quietly, "is that the idea of Feneth near you makes me want to remove him from the building, and I am aware that this is—" He paused. "Disproportionate." "Slightly," she agreed, "and not something I have any right to." "Not yet," she said. He went very still. She felt the weight of those 2 words sit between them and refused to take them back. She had said them quietly and precisely, and she meant both of them. The not and the yet, and from the way his eyes changed, she understood he had heard both as well. "Sabine," he said, her name in his voice, the way it always sounded, like something he had been carrying carefully. "The session starts in 10 minutes, she said. "You should go." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he turned and left, and she pressed her hand against the writing table beside her and breathed, and told herself that she was managing this admirably. The inquiry concluded that afternoon. The findings were what everyone in the council chamber had already known. The attack had been orchestrated. The men were hired agents. The investigation was ongoing. Sabine's testimony was formally recorded and entered into evidence. She was thanked by the council with appropriate gravity and formally released from the proceedings. She packed her bag that evening. She was standing at the window, looking at the dark gardens, when Calder knocked. "His Grace requests your presence," Calder said. "At your convenience. Now, if it pleases you." It did not, she thought, particularly please her, in the sense that she was tired and her side ached and she had been managing her own feelings about this palace and this duke for 2 days with increasing difficulty. She went. He was in the library. She had expected a formal room, a receiving chamber with appropriate ducal furniture. The library surprised her. It was enormous and slightly chaotic, books in stacks as well as shelves, a fire burning warmly. 2 chairs positioned near it that looked as if they had been pulled into that arrangement habitually, rather than for occasion. It looked like a room where someone actually lived. Killian was standing at the window when she came in. He turned when he heard her, and she saw, for the first time since she had arrived at the palace, something in his face that was not controlled. Something that was tired and honest, and younger than his bearing usually allowed. "You're leaving tomorrow," he said. "The inquiry is finished." "Yes." He moved toward the fire. "Sit, please." She sat in one of the chairs. After a moment he sat in the other seat. They were closer than they had been in the council room. The firelight was warm and the room was quiet, and the world outside the palace had retreated to a comfortable distance. "Aldrich Feneth requested your address today," Killian said. She stared at him. "He what?" He cited the formal proceedings, claimed he might need to send follow-up questions. Something moved in his expression. I declined to provide it. That was... She started, possibly overstepping. "Yes," he held her gaze. "I cannot find it in me to regret it." She should have been annoyed. She identified carefully that she was not annoyed. "You have staff who handle correspondence. You could have simply had them redirect any inquiry through official channels." "I could have. Instead, you personally declined a council member's request for my address." "I did. Because he does not need your address for professional reasons, and we both know it." His voice was quiet and entirely without apology. "And because I have been managing, since the moment you walked into this palace, the very strong desire to make it clear to anyone who approaches you with intentions, I do not trust that you are..." He stopped. She waited. "That you are not available in the way they are imagining," he finished, with the quality of someone choosing words carefully while their feelings arrange themselves into something more honest beneath. The fire settled. Somewhere outside, the night wind moved through the formal gardens. "Killian," she said, "what are you asking me?" He looked at her across the small space between the chairs. "I am asking you to come back," he said. "Not for testimony, not for protocol. I am asking you to come back because I cannot think of a version of the next several months that does not begin with wondering when you will be here again. A pause. I am aware this is fast. It is very fast. I am aware it is complicated. Extremely complicated. I am aware that I have no right to ask it, that you have a life and a practice and a father, and that coming back here requires something of you that I am not entitled to require." He held her gaze. "But I am asking anyway, because you told me you were willing to continue the conversation, because I have been honest with you since the cottage, and I would like to continue being honest, and because..." His voice went quieter. "You are the first person in a very long time who made me feel something I had stopped expecting to feel." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that holds things carefully. She looked at him. This duke who had given her one name in a dark cottage, who had written 4 words at the bottom of a letter, who had personally declined a council member's request and placed royal guards on her father's house, and watched her with iron-gray eyes that she was going to be thinking about for a very long time. "I need to go home first," she said. "My father's patients need covering. There are things I need to arrange." He waited. "But after that," she said, "I am willing to come back." Something happened to his face. Not relief, exactly. Something quieter and more significant than relief. Something that looked, she thought, like a man setting down something he had been carrying for a long time. "When?" he asked. 2 weeks. 2 weeks, he agreed. She stood. He stood with her because he always did. That small, practiced courtesy that she had noticed in the cottage and recognized now as entirely habitual, not performed. He walked her to the door of the library. He stopped there. She stopped there. They were very close, the way they had been several times now without touching, that particular charged proximity that was its own kind of intimacy. "Sabine," he said. "Yes?" "The 5th man, the one who escaped." His voice dropped low. "My people will find him. But until they do..." He stopped, and she saw in his face what he was not saying, the particular controlled fear of someone who has decided that something matters to them and is now acutely aware of what that means for risk. "I'll be careful," she said. "I know." He held her gaze. "I will also be sending Calder." She blinked. "To my village?" "He will be discreet." "Killian, please," he said, quietly. The word from him felt like something rare. She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said softly. He exhaled. And then, because she had been sensible and careful and composed for 2 days and 2 nights, and she was 23 years old and not entirely made of practicality, she reached up and touched his face. One hand, brief, her palm against his jaw, the way she had once checked a patient for fever, and this time was not that at all. He went completely still beneath her hand. His eyes closed for 1 second. When they opened, they were darker than iron, darker than gray, something more private than either. She dropped her hand. Stepped back. 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks, he said, and his voice was different, low and careful and completely steady in the way of something that has just decided something important. She walked back to her room. She packed the last of her things. She lay down in the enormous bed and looked at the ceiling and felt the warmth of him still against her palm. She thought about what she was walking toward. She thought about what a duke meant and what she meant, and the enormous complicated distance between their worlds. She thought about 5 cuts in the dark and a letter with 4 words at the bottom. She thought about the way he looked when she said not yet. She fell asleep. In the morning, the carriage took her home. In 2 weeks, she came back. She came back for testimony and for a man who had watched her with iron-gray eyes and called it something other than duty. She came back to a palace that had roses on the writing table and a library with 2 chairs pulled close to the fire. She came back to a conversation they had been building since a forest path at midnight. She came back, and this time she came back choosing it, not because a stranger needed saving, not because a summons required her presence, but because she had decided, with all the calm and considered clarity of a woman who trusted her own instincts, even when they frightened her, that some things were worth walking toward. What happened in those weeks, the investigation that turned, the council member whose motives darkened, the threat that came closer before it was ended, was a story still unfolding, but it began there. In a library with a firelight and 2 chairs and a man who had learned, from a girl with steady hands and no particular instinct for self-preservation, that the most important things were not the ones you were supposed to protect. They were the ones that protected you first, without knowing why, in the dark, without asking anything in return. That was the beginning of it. And what a beginning it was if Sabine and Killian have taken up residence in your heart. They have certainly taken up residence in ours. This is the kind of love that begins in sacrifice and builds into something unshakable, and we could not be more grateful that you stayed with us until the very end. There is a truth in this story worth keeping. Sometimes the bravest thing is not the wound you take for someone else. It is the choice you make afterward, when the danger has passed and the world is quiet, to walk back toward the thing that frightened you most, not because you have to, but because something in you already knows it is worth it. Do not leave without subscribing to the Duke Royal Tales. Every story we tell is crafted for those who believe that love built on honesty and courage is the only kind worth having. Like this video if Sabine made you feel something. Comment and tell us, at what moment did you know Killian was falling for her? We read every single one. Share this with someone who needs a story that reminds them. The right person will notice you in the dark, and they will not forget it. Thank you for being here. Truly, the Duke Royal Tales.